Chosen one, heaven doesn't just whisper warnings. Heaven issues decrees. When God speaks, the atmosphere doesn't just shift, it completely rearranges itself. And right now, whether you feel ready or not, that rearranging has already begun. Judgment isn't just approaching. It has stepped right into the room, pulled up a chair, and started a divine roll call that nobody wants to hear. Before we go any further, here's a fact most people ignore. Psychologists have found that when a person operates in deception long enough, their mind actually begins to believe their own lies. Now, imagine how dangerous that becomes when those same delusional people form cliques, alliances, or little spiritual cults, entirely convinced they can outmaneuver God himself. That alone should be enough to make you grab your popcorn. Let's be clear. This isn't the kind of judgment where lightning strikes and everyone suddenly repents like in a dramatic movie scene. No. This is the kind where God lets the wicked trip over the very traps they set for you. Then he watches silently as they try to pretend the ground didn't just swallow their plans whole. It's poetic. It's divine. And yes, sometimes it's a little funny because some of the people who plotted against you really thought God was going to adjust his schedule to honor their foolishness. This season is entirely different. This is where heaven draws a line around you. Not just a circle of protection, but a circle of authority. And everything outside of it starts malfunctioning. People who once looked so organized suddenly can't even coordinate their own shadows. Their alliances start arguing with their own lies. Their plotters forget their script. Their gossipers begin confessing by accident. Everything they built in the darkness collapses under the heavy weight of God's light, and absolutely nothing about it is subtle. Meanwhile, you, the one they counted out, the one they targeted, the one they underestimated, are stepping into a momentum they cannot interrupt. They threw absolutely everything at you except logic, and now the same God they mocked is rewriting the whole storyline in your favor. Judgment has ensued. The wicked are totally exposed. The cult is unraveling. And you? You are stepping into the kind of unstoppable rise that makes heaven applaud, and your enemies suddenly remember errands they didn't have. This is not just the beginning of your comeback. This is the grand unveiling of what was already written about you. And trust me, God didn't write your story to end with you defeated. He wrote it to end with them confused, convicted, and completely incapable of stopping you. Number one, God didn't just expose the wicked, he exposed their dependency on you. The truth that most chosen ones don't realize at first is that the exposure happening in this season isn't simply about revealing who hated you, who gossiped about you, or who plotted against you. The deeper revelation, the one that really stings them, is that God exposed just how dependent they were on the very person they tried to destroy. This is the kind of exposure that cuts straight through pride, illusions, and fake power. Because when someone is truly strong, they don't need to drain someone else just to stay standing. For years, some of these people pretended that you were insignificant. They acted like your presence didn't matter, like your voice was small, and like your gifts were nothing special. But the moment God pulled the curtain back, you finally saw the truth they hoped you'd never figure out. They were feeding off your energy, your kindness, your ideas, your strength, and your resilience the entire time. They were drawing from you like a hidden power source, hoping you wouldn't notice the spiritual, emotional, and even mental withdrawals happening right under your nose. The surprising part is that the exposure didn't come through drama or chaos. It came through absence. When you finally pulled back, detached, grew, healed, set boundaries, or simply outgrew them, their entire system began to malfunction. Suddenly, their confidence shifted. Their behavior changed. Their stability started cracking. They couldn't produce without you. They couldn't inspire without you. They couldn't perform without the energy they had been siphoning. And as embarrassing as it is for them, this season revealed that everything they built was leaning on the strength of someone they once looked down on. That's why judgment is unfolding. Not because you begged God to punish them, but because God had to show you the real dynamic they kept hidden. He had to show you the truth of who was the source and who was the parasite. Once that was established, the tables turned instantly. You walked into clarity, and they walked into consequences. You moved forward, and they ran out of energy because their supply was never theirs in the first place. This season isn't exposing their wickedness alone. It's exposing your absolute worth. And that realization is the very reason you can't be stopped. Number 2, their judgment began the day you stopped explaining yourself. There comes a moment in every chosen one's life when something shifts, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet finality that even heaven takes note of. That moment is the day you stop explaining yourself. It's the day you stop breaking down your intentions for people who twist them. You stop defending your character to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop giving access to people who have no intention of valuing it. That day is more than an emotional milestone. In the spiritual realm, it is a bold declaration, and it's the exact moment their judgment quietly begins. Wicked people thrive on access, not physical access alone, but emotional access, mental access, and spiritual access. They thrive on having a clear window into your mind and your heart. They want to know exactly what you're thinking, how you're feeling, and what you're planning so they can distort it, weaponize it, or use it to their advantage. The ability to pull you into long explanations, circular conversations, or draining interactions is a power they deeply feed on. When you explain yourself, you give them a thread to pull on. When you stop, they lose their grip completely. What makes this moment so powerful is that you didn't have to announce anything. You didn't send a grand speech or a warning. You just stopped. You outgrew the desperate need to convince people who never wanted to understand you in the first place. You rose high above their manipulation, their guilt tactics, their gaslighting, and their subtle attempts to keep you tied to their control. In heaven's eyes, that moment is officially recorded as the beginning of separation, where you step completely out of their influence and God steps in to take over. People don't realize how spiritually serious it is when someone finally reaches that point of pure silence. Your silence wasn't weakness at all. It was hard evidence of growth. It was undeniable proof that you had matured past the point where they could provoke you or drag you into their emotional chaos. God honors moments exactly like that. And once he sees that you're no longer entertaining their toxic behavior, he begins holding them strictly accountable for every act they thought they got away with. Their judgment didn't come because you fought back. It came because you simply stopped playing their game. Without your explanations to hide behind, their true character stood totally exposed. Without your words to twist, their real intentions became incredibly obvious. When you stopped explaining, they completely stopped having excuses, and their massive downfall started the exact same day your peace became totally non-negotiable. Number 3, the cult didn't fear your gift. They feared losing control over the one who carries it. People often assume that the deep envy and resistance you faced were all about your talent, your intelligence, your massive potential, or your spiritual sensitivity. But the absolute truth goes much deeper than that. Your amazing gift wasn't the real threat. What truly rattled them to their core was the possibility that you might wake up one day and finally realize you didn't need their approval, their validation, or their system to operate at your full capacity. Their fear was never your ability. Their fear was your total independence. The exact moment you step into the full awareness of your own value, the entire dynamic shifts. When you fully understand your strength, you absolutely no longer chase people who benefit from your confusion. When you deeply understand your calling, you completely stop allowing others to define your path. And when you totally understand your power, you stop tolerating environments that shrink you down. This is exactly what they were terrified of. The day they could no longer influence what you think, what you deeply believe, and what direction you choose to move in. What made them gather up in groups, whisper quietly in corners, form dark alliances, or even act totally cult-like wasn't unity at all. It was pure insecurity. Their fake unity was completely built on the shared fear that they would lose their tight grip on you. They saw something beautiful in you that you hadn't fully seen yet. A massive strength that simply didn't need them. A bright light that absolutely didn't depend on their approval. And a massive destiny that couldn't possibly be rewritten by their opinions. Once they realized they had absolutely no real power over your identity, they panicked. Their main goal was to keep you constantly doubting yourself. Because a totally self-assured chosen one is absolutely unstoppable. They desperately wanted you second-guessing your amazing abilities, questioning your deep worth, and staying tightly tied to them emotionally or mentally. If they could totally control your self-perception, they could easily control everything else. That's exactly why they manipulated you, isolated you, gossiped about you, and tried their hardest to make you feel completely powerless without them. It wasn't actually hatred, it was deep fear cleverly disguised as hostility. But when God totally exposed them, He didn't just show their wickedness. He completely revealed their deep dependence. He revealed exactly how much energy they put into keeping you totally unaware of your own greatness. And once you stepped completely out of their grip, their entire structure fell completely apart. Not because you fought them, but because you were the actual foundation holding up their false sense of power. The truth is incredibly simple. They absolutely never feared your gift. They feared the exact day you recognized that the massive gift was completely yours, not theirs to control. Number 4. God allowed their attacks because He needed a public record of their motives. One of the absolute hardest truths for a chosen one to ever accept is that God will sometimes allow the wicked to act boldly, totally openly, and without any immediate consequences. Not because He favors them in any way, not because He forgot about you, and absolutely not because He wanted you to suffer. He allowed it because every single move they made was actively building a massive public record. Something undeniably clear, totally unmistakable, and completely impossible for them to ever talk their way out of when judgment finally arrived. Heaven absolutely does not rule based on quiet whispers, rumors, or assumptions. Heaven rules strictly based on hard evidence, and the wicked made absolutely sure to present plenty of it. Every single lie they told about you became a permanent part of that record. Every desperate attempt to sabotage your good name, your character, your amazing progress, or your divine purpose added to their massive file. Every single moment you calmly held your peace while they totally escalated their behavior loudly showed the stunning contrast between your pure integrity and their dark intentions. They truly thought they were completely destroying you behind the scenes, but they were actually actively documenting their very own downfall, step by step. The real reason some of their vicious attacks were allowed to continue far longer than you ever expected is because God wasn't just casually collecting information. He was actively letting them totally expose themselves. He let them completely reveal their dark motives through their sheer arrogance, their deep jealousy, their crazy obsession, and their total desperation. He let them talk loudly, lie, slander, and plot because they desperately needed to show exactly who they really were without the fake mask. If He had stopped them way too early, they would have loudly claimed they were totally innocent, deeply misunderstood, or unfairly victimized. But God gave them more than enough room to completely show their true nature without any confusion at all. And while they were incredibly busy digging their deep hole even deeper, you were incredibly busy growing. Your deep patience, your amazing resilience, and your total silence became powerful testimonies completely in your favor. You absolutely didn't fight dirty, you didn't retaliate, and you totally didn't match their toxic behavior. You simply let your character speak for you, and heaven totally took note of every single moment. The stunning contrast between your pure heart and their dark actions became so incredibly distinct that absolutely no one can pretend not to clearly see it now. When massive judgment finally arrives, it's never ever random. It's completely precise, it's totally justified, it's completely irrefutable. God allowed their toxic actions because He absolutely wanted there to be a complete public record, not just for heaven, but for the entire world to see. They absolutely can't say they didn't mean it. They absolutely can't claim any confusion. They completely can't rewrite the past. They totally expose themselves loudly, and now the massive consequences will be just as incredibly loud. They absolutely didn't write your downfall. They completely wrote their very own sentencing. Number 5, they didn't want you destroyed. They wanted you completely unaware of how powerful you already are. The absolute greatest threat to the wicked was never your complete downfall. It was your total awakening. They absolutely didn't need you gone. They desperately needed you confused, hesitant, doubtful, and completely disconnected from your true identity. Their entire strategy was completely built on keeping you spiritually asleep, because a chosen one who truly knows exactly who they are is a massive force they absolutely cannot manipulate, distract, or delay. They completely understood your massive power long before you ever did. And that's precisely why they heavily invested so much energy into totally clouding your vision. People very rarely go after exactly what they don't fear. The massive level of effort they put into completely breaking your confidence revealed exactly how much authority you actively carried without even realizing it. They heavily used subtle, sneaky tactics, mocking your ideas just to make you second-guess yourself, twisting conversations to keep you totally off balance, pretending not to see your amazing growth so you'd actually think it wasn't real. They acted totally confused whenever you boldly spoke truth, acting as if your deep insight was total nonsense just to make you deeply question your discernment. Every single move was highly intentional, not to completely destroy you physically, but to absolutely make sure you never discovered the massive power you naturally walk with. Because once you see clearly, you absolutely can't unsee it. Once you truly wake up, you completely don't fall back into the exact same trap. Once you totally recognize your massive strength, their cheap opinions completely lose all importance. They knew the exact moment you realized your true worth, their toxic influence would completely evaporate like smoke. They deeply feared the day you would completely stop asking for their fake approval. They heavily feared the day you would totally stop shrinking yourself just to be accepted. They completely feared the day you would finally stand fully in the exact identity God gave you. And that day absolutely came. The massive shift completely didn't happen because they backed off. It totally happened because God completely removed the thick veil from your eyes. He clearly showed you not only exactly who they were, but exactly who you are. Your deep clarity completely became their total collapse. The exact moment your mind completely aligned with your calling, their toxic manipulation absolutely lost all effect. The fake power they totally thought they had over you was absolutely nothing more than a cheap, temporary illusion that completely depended on your confusion. Once that confusion totally lifted, so did their relevance. The Dark War officially ended, not when they stopped attacking, but when you totally stopped doubting yourself. Their entire corrupt system was completely built on keeping you totally unaware, and the exact moment you proudly stepped into awareness, absolutely everything they built completely crumbled. They completely haven't accepted it yet, but the absolute truth is incredibly simple. They absolutely never had real power over you, only over the unawakened version of you that simply didn't know exactly who you were. Number 6. Judgment isn't about cheap revenge. It's entirely about restoring the massive flow of what was heavily blocked by their hands. The delays you faced in life were absolutely never a sign that God was completely ignoring you or actively withholding anything from you. The absolute truth is so much simpler and incredibly more revealing. The massive blessings meant exactly for you were heavily tampered with by people who felt deeply threatened by your amazing calling. These were incredibly toxic individuals who constantly operated from a very dark place of absolute lack, emotionally, spiritually, and deeply morally. They truly believed that if they could successfully interfere with your amazing progress, they could somehow mysteriously make themselves much more important, far more valuable, or entirely more ahead. Their toxic actions absolutely didn't just come from cheap jealousy. They came directly from the deep, paralyzing fear that your amazing rise would completely expose their absolute lack. Instead of growing themselves, they desperately tried to completely block your growth. Instead of building themselves up, they completely tried to sabotage you. And absolutely every time they stepped directly in front of something beautiful God sent your way, a major opportunity, a massive connection, a total breakthrough, they absolutely weren't completely preventing the blessing. They were simply holding it in place. Massive blessings assigned by God absolutely do not disappear. They totally don't get canceled. They completely stack up. They actively wait. And when God officially decides the massive dam has been tightly shut long enough, He violently breaks it wide open in a way that absolutely nobody can ever stop, reverse, or completely interfere with. That is exactly what true judgment really looks like in your amazing life right now. It's absolutely not about God violently striking them down. It's completely about God totally rerouting absolutely everything they desperately tried to intercept. It's about beautifully restoring the massive flow that was completely blocked by their deep insecurity. It's about officially releasing absolutely everything that completely piled up while they were incredibly busy meddling in exactly what was absolutely never theirs to touch. Their toxic interference completely didn't change your destiny. It only actively created a massive buildup of incredible blessings that completely now have absolutely no choice but to totally overtake you. This is exactly why your next season feels incredibly intense. The massive momentum is incredibly strong. The complete shift is totally obvious. You're absolutely not receiving blessings one by one. You're receiving massive waves of exactly what has been completely held back for years. Every single lie they told, every single door they desperately tried to close, every single connection they totally tried to ruin, only added massive pressure directly behind the spiritual dam. And once God officially decided their time was totally up, absolutely every wall they built completely had to break. True judgment is absolutely not God just getting back at them. It's God giving everything back to you. It's God beautifully restoring absolutely everything that was actively interfered with. It's God totally making sure you receive every single blessing with massive interest. The exact same hands that desperately tried to completely block your flow are exactly now the very reason your massive blessings are beautifully pouring in all at once. God absolutely didn't forget you. He was actively preparing a massive release they could absolutely never stop. Number 7. God let you walk through their intense darkness so you could completely learn the dark architecture of evil. There are absolutely some deep lessons a chosen one can completely never learn from just reading books, listening to speeches, hearing sermons, or taking in motivational words. Your massive calling absolutely requires a deep wisdom that can completely only come from being heavily exposed to exactly what most people desperately run away from. That's exactly why God specifically allowed you to bravely walk through environments, toxic relationships, and dark situations that were vastly darker, much heavier, and significantly more draining than absolutely anything you ever expected. It completely wasn't a cruel punishment. It absolutely wasn't abandonment. It was intense, elite training. Raw, totally unfiltered, deep spiritual training that completely couldn't be taught from the outside. God deeply needed you to completely understand the entire architecture of evil from the absolute inside out. Most regular people completely only recognize evil when it becomes totally obvious. They completely only notice toxic manipulation when it violently explodes. They completely only see deep betrayal once it's fully, completely matured. But you were intensely trained to see it in its absolute earliest stages. You completely learned exactly how dark deception starts, incredibly small. You completely learned exactly how toxic manipulation begins with something totally harmless. You completely learned exactly how deep envy beautifully masks itself as genuine concern. Exactly how tight control cleverly disguises itself as loving guidance. And exactly how truly wicked people very often proudly present themselves as the absolute most charming individuals in the room. You absolutely didn't learn this from reading theory. You completely learned it from bravely surviving it. Every single confusing moment, every completely unexpected attack, every entirely strange shift in people's behavior was a massive part of the exact curriculum God officially enrolled you in. You completely learned the exact patterns of deep dishonesty. You completely learned the dark energy of hidden toxic agendas. You completely learned to deeply pay attention to tone, perfect timing, complete silence, and total inconsistency. You completely learned exactly who people truly become when they totally think absolutely no one is watching. Your amazing spirit completely became fluent in a dark language most normal people absolutely don't even know exists. This intense training totally didn't just sharpen your deep intuition. It completely rewired your entire spiritual perception. It totally made you someone who can completely sense a dark motive without needing hard evidence. Someone who can clearly feel danger long before it officially arrives. Someone who can easily see the trap long before it's even fully set. This is exactly why your deep discernment is so incredibly advanced. This is exactly why certain toxic people completely can't fool you anymore. This is exactly why dark manipulation completely doesn't land the way it used to. God bravely walked you completely through their darkness, right until you could completely recognize evil purely by its structure, not its fake appearance. And now that you've completely learned this dark architecture, truly wicked people have totally lost their absolute advantage. They absolutely can't surprise you because you've completely already seen the entire blueprint. They totally can't confuse you because you completely understand the whole layout. They absolutely can't trap you because you've bravely walked through more than enough darkness to completely know every exit, every dark shadow, and every deeply hidden door. Your intense training was absolutely never about needless suffering. It was entirely about absolute mastery. And right now that you've totally mastered the deep architecture of evil, you're confidently stepping into an amazing season where dark deception has absolutely no power over you ever again. Number 8. They desperately tried to completely break your spirit because they absolutely couldn't break your massive assignment. They truly thought that completely breaking your amazing spirit would totally disconnect you from your massive destiny. But they absolutely never understood that your incredible assignment completely wasn't tied to your fluctuating emotions. It was entirely tied to your very existence. You absolutely weren't just called to this massive mission. You were specifically born directly into it. That absolutely means even on your absolute worst day, you're completely still a massive threat. Even when you're incredibly drained, you're completely still deeply chosen. Even when you're heavily questioning absolutely everything, heaven is absolutely not questioning you. Your toxic enemies completely miscalculated your deep wiring. They foolishly assumed your spirit operated exactly like theirs. Fragile, deeply insecure, incredibly shaky, and totally dependent on constant validation. But your beautiful spirit was entirely engineered differently. It actively carries deep codes they absolutely don't have, massive endurance they completely can't replicate, and incredible resilience they absolutely can't understand. Your beautiful spirit is a massive blueprint they could absolutely never decode. Absolutely, no matter how many countless times they desperately tried to study you, copy you, or totally manipulate you. And that's exactly why their desperate attacks completely failed. They absolutely didn't fail because you were somehow totally untouchable. They completely failed because your massive assignment was totally untouchable. You were deeply covered not because you were absolutely perfect, but entirely because you were deeply purposed. They fiercely went after your deep confidence because they absolutely couldn't access your holy covenant. They heavily triggered dark warfare because they completely couldn't touch your divine work. They specifically targeted your brilliant mind because they absolutely couldn't sabotage your massive mandate. What they absolutely didn't realize is that every single desperate attempt to completely break you only actively activated even more of your massive calling. Every single nasty insult hit your beautiful spirit exactly like a massive reset button. Every single deep betrayal completely sharpened your amazing discernment. Every single heavy loss completely pulled you significantly deeper into perfect alignment. They truly thought they were deeply damaging you, but they were actually completely confirming you. And exactly when God totally judged them, He absolutely didn't judge them for simply disliking you. He completely judged them for daring to touch an assignment He absolutely never gave them permission to interfere with. Your toxic enemies absolutely weren't punished for having bad opinions. They were completely judged for their massive obstruction. They desperately tried to totally sabotage exactly what heaven had completely signed off on. They desperately tried to entirely interrupt exactly what was divinely, perfectly scheduled. They desperately tried to heavily tamper with the massive destiny of someone who was clearly marked long before they were even born. Their dark attacks completely awakened your deep authority. Their incredible cruelty completely awakened your amazing clarity. Their deep betrayal completely awakened your massive blueprint. Your beautiful spirit absolutely didn't break. It beautifully evolved. It grew sharp teeth. It grew massive vision. It grew a solid backbone. It grew deep fire. You're absolutely not the exact same person they desperately tried to break. You're the incredibly powerful version of you that completely exists right after heaven massively intervenes. And that specific version is totally unstoppable. Number 9. Massive judgment was heavily triggered when you finally completely outgrew the old version of you they could easily manipulate. True judgment absolutely didn't fall just because you heavily cried. True judgment absolutely didn't fall just because you were incredibly mistreated. Massive judgment totally fell the exact moment you completely elevated. The exact moment you proudly rose fully into the deep identity heaven absolutely always knew you would eventually step into. The exact moment you completely outgrew your deep old wounds, old toxic patterns, old deep fears, and old naive ways. That's exactly when absolutely everything completely shifted. Because the old version of you they were heavily manipulating absolutely wasn't the real you at all. It was the deeply unawakened you. And once the completely real you fully emerged, their dark influence totally evaporated. Your toxic enemies were absolutely never truly afraid of losing you. They were entirely afraid of losing their total ability to tightly control you. They absolutely weren't panicking just because your amazing life improved. They were completely panicking because your deep perception heavily improved. You totally began to clearly see straight through the dark tactics they heavily depended on. You clearly recognized the toxic cycles they constantly used to deeply drain you. You perfectly realized the deep emotional hooks they heavily pulled to constantly destabilize you. Their entire dark strategy depended completely on you staying totally blind, incredibly small, deeply insecure, or foolishly loyal to old versions of yourself you had absolutely already outgrown. But total spiritual evolution completely destroys dark spiritual manipulation. When God completely upgraded your deep identity, every single old, dark entry point was totally sealed shut. What totally used to trigger you now completely bores you. What completely used to heavily intimidate you now completely exposes them. What completely used to heavily confuse you now totally reveals their dark intentions with terrifying clarity. Your deep healing completely cut off all their access. Your massive growth completely shut down all their permissions. Your massive elevation completely disabled all their dark spiritual passwords. And that's exactly what completely activated the massive judgment. True judgment absolutely wasn't simply a basic response to their bad behavior. It was heaven's loud announcement that you have completely ascended far beyond their dirty reach. When they desperately attempted to forcefully re-enter your life, they absolutely weren't just revisiting the old past. They were completely trespassing. They were desperately trying to access an incredibly outdated version of you that absolutely no longer exists, and heaven completely deemed it a massive violation. They constantly kept heavily chasing the old you entirely because the amazing new you is completely untouchable. They constantly kept desperately trying to pull you right back entirely because the fully elevated you completely exposes every single dark lie they built their fake power on. And God absolutely doesn't just heavily judge wicked actions. He completely judges the sheer audacity of those who desperately attempt to drag his amazing chosen ones right back into old identities he completely already delivered them from. You absolutely didn't just outgrow them. You completely evolved far beyond the dark spiritual frequency they constantly operate on. And the exact moment you totally did, massive judgment completely became unavoidable. Their massive downfall is absolutely not a basic reaction to your deep suffering. It's a complete reaction to your total transformation. Because exactly once heaven fully updates your deep identity, absolutely anyone who desperately tries to handle you exactly like the old you completely becomes heavily subject to massive consequences that were absolutely never meant for you, only completely for those who totally refuse to accept your massive elevation. Number 10. The cult's fake power was completely an illusion, and your total awakening forcefully made it entirely collapse. Their so-called strength was absolutely never real. It was an entire performance fully staged directly in the dark, heavily relying entirely on you, absolutely not knowing exactly how much deep authority you actively carried. What completely looked exactly like massive power was entirely simply quiet coordination. What completely looked exactly like massive influence was entirely really deep insecurity, desperately hiding right behind big numbers. What completely looked exactly like deep spiritual dominance was absolutely nothing but incredibly empty intimidation, completely propped up entirely by dark secrecy and deep fear. The exact moment God completely awakened you, the heavy curtain totally dropped. And absolutely everything they carefully built completely started violently shaking. Entirely because their entire dark system completely depended entirely on you deeply staying asleep. They absolutely didn't fear deep exposure from random outsiders. They completely feared total exposure directly from you. You were entirely the absolute only one who could completely see straight through their dark structure, perfectly decode their dark intentions, and totally dismantle their dark tactics completely without even lifting a single finger. And the exact moment your deep awareness fully rose, their fake power entirely became completely transparent. Dark manipulation completely only works exactly when the specific target hasn't fully identified it. Every single dark spell they cast heavily relied entirely on you constantly doubting yourself. Every single dark ritual heavily relied entirely on you constantly staying deeply emotionally vulnerable. Every single highly coordinated dark attack heavily relied entirely on you constantly being far too compassionate to truly understand the intense warfare constantly happening right behind your back. Your total awakening completely removed the exact fuel they desperately lived on. The deep silence you kept, totally gone. The deep empathy they constantly drained, completely reclaimed. The massive presence they constantly fed on, entirely withdrawn. Totally without your deep energy, their dark system completely starved. Totally without your pure innocence, their dark strategy completely collapsed. Totally without your active participation, their fake hierarchy completely fell totally apart. They desperately needed you vastly more than you absolutely ever needed them. And massive judgment completely revealed exactly that they were entirely parasites, totally masquerading as grand puppeteers. Exactly what they falsely called massive power was entirely really deep dependency. Exactly what they falsely called massive unity was entirely mutual, deep fear. Exactly what they falsely called massive strategy was entirely sheer desperation. Exactly what they falsely called massive control was entirely heavily borrowed influence completely stolen directly from your unawareness. And God completely allowed your total awakening to completely flip the entire dark structure entirely upside down. You completely became the heavy mirror that perfectly showed them the absolute truth. You completely became the bright light that perfectly revealed their total weakness. You completely became the deep clarity that perfectly exposed their total dysfunction. They absolutely weren't strong. You entirely just hadn't yet totally realized you were absolutely the one completely holding their entire dark operation totally together. Massive judgment absolutely didn't simply just take them down. It perfectly revealed exactly that they were entirely already completely collapsing long before you ever walked away. Your deep awareness absolutely didn't simply weaken them. It perfectly exposed exactly that they entirely had absolutely no real strength to even begin with. Their entire fake empire was completely built on exactly one incredibly fragile condition: you completely not knowing exactly who you are. The exact moment that completely changed, the Dark War totally ended. The massive illusion completely shattered, and absolutely everything they carefully built, exactly in the dark, completely crumbled right under the massive weight of your total awakening. Number 11, God absolutely isn't just defending you. He's completely rewriting the entire false narrative they desperately tried to carefully script for your life. Their completely fake version of your deep story was absolutely never ever meant to stand. They spent countless years desperately trying to completely shape exactly how the whole world saw you, heavily using dark rumors exactly like ink and dark manipulation exactly like a massive printing press. They desperately tried to completely brand you as incredibly unstable, deeply weak, totally lost, heavily confused, or deeply dangerous. Absolutely anything that would perfectly keep people from ever recognizing the massive light resting on your life. They absolutely didn't just aggressively attack your deep character. They desperately tried to falsely narrate your massive destiny, but God absolutely never, ever gave them any publishing rights over your deep identity. And massive judgment is his perfect way of completely repossessing every single false chapter they desperately forged. They forcefully added deep fear exactly to the chapters where God had beautifully written massive courage. They forcefully inserted deep shame exactly into the beautiful pages where God had beautifully written massive redemption. They desperately tried to completely replace your amazing progress with heavy setbacks and heavily push a completely false narrative exactly where you absolutely never rise, absolutely never grow, and absolutely never become exactly who you were deeply meant to be. But God is powerfully stepping completely in, actively crossing out all their dark lies, perfectly line by beautiful line, perfect sentence by beautiful sentence, right until the completely false story they desperately tried to heavily spread totally evaporates right under his absolute truth. This is absolutely not simple defense. This is massive divine authorship. People who once completely only heard their totally false version of you are perfectly about to actively witness God's absolutely true version of you beautifully unfold right in front of their very eyes. The exact same mouths that loudly reported dark lies will completely now have to loudly repeat massive testimonies. The exact same ears that eagerly absorb dark rumors will completely now perfectly hear the absolute truth with massive clarity. The exact same people who were completely comfortable eagerly writing you totally off will completely now be incredibly uncomfortable actively watching you massively rise. They truly thought they were eagerly writing your dark obituary, but God beautifully turned it completely into a beautiful preface. Massive judgment perfectly means total reconstruction. It perfectly means God absolutely doesn't just clear your good name, he beautifully elevates it. It perfectly means the completely false narrative they heavily pushed is absolutely no longer relevant, completely believable, or totally valid. It perfectly means the deep story completely shifts so incredibly drastically, exactly, that even all those who deeply doubted you will completely question exactly how they ever foolishly believed absolutely anything else. God is beautifully rewriting your deep identity, completely publicly. He's beautifully restoring the massive reputation they desperately tried to heavily stain. He's beautifully deleting the false descriptions they desperately tried to heavily attach to you. And he's beautifully highlighting the absolute truth they desperately tried to deeply bury right under heavy layers of deep jealousy, massive insecurity, and dark projection. You're absolutely not just being defended, you're completely being totally redefined. The whole world absolutely won't ever meet the totally false version they desperately tried to carefully create. The whole world will beautifully meet the exact version God absolutely always intended. And that specific version absolutely cannot be lied on, completely erased, or entirely rewritten by absolutely anyone but him. Number 12. You absolutely weren't just protected, you were deeply studied exactly by heaven. God absolutely didn't just casually watch over you from a far distance. He deeply paid very close attention. There's a massive difference between being deeply guarded and being heavily evaluated. And heaven absolutely wasn't just entirely surrounding you with heavy protection. It was actively taking deep note of exactly who you completely were exactly when absolutely nobody was clapping, absolutely nobody was helping, and absolutely nobody was acknowledging your deep struggle. Heavy protection beautifully kept you totally alive. But deep observation perfectly recorded your massive growth. Every single silent, beautiful choice you completely made beautifully became hard evidence totally in your favor long before massive judgment ever began. When total chaos would have been the vastly easier reaction, you beautifully chose deep calm. Absolutely not because you were deeply weak, but entirely because your beautiful spirit absolutely refused to be heavily dragged right into the deep dirt with exactly the people who actively lived there. Heaven perfectly recorded exactly that. When you completely could have easily retaliated and actively made the wicked deeply regret every single dark word, every single dark rumor, every single dark setup. You completely instead kept your deep integrity totally intact. Absolutely not because you were deeply naive, but entirely because your beautiful soul completely knew deep revenge is a very cheap trade exactly for massive destiny. Heaven perfectly documented exactly that too. And exactly when your life felt incredibly heavy enough to easily break absolutely anyone else, you beautifully kept heavily moving entirely forward. Absolutely, even exactly when absolutely no one completely knew exactly how much massive strength it really took exactly just to bravely stand totally upright. That absolutely didn't go totally unnoticed. Those beautiful moments absolutely weren't random. They were deep spiritual qualifications. Your deep restraint was hard evidence. Your deep patience was hard evidence. Your massive endurance was hard evidence. Your deep compassion, absolutely even exactly when freely given exactly to people who completely didn't deserve it, was hard evidence. Heaven deeply studied your beautiful reactions, exactly the exact way a massive king deeply studies the true character of the exact one he actively plans to highly promote. God absolutely wasn't just casually counting your deep tears. He was actively measuring your massive maturity. He absolutely wasn't just entirely shielding you completely from evil. He was heavily evaluating exactly how deeply you completely could be highly trusted, perfectly, once he completely elevated you far above it. The wicked absolutely didn't truly know exactly that. While they were incredibly busy, desperately plotting to heavily discredit you, you were actively building a massive spiritual portfolio, exactly, that perfectly made their dark attacks look incredibly small, deeply petty, and ultimately totally pointless. Massive judgment is absolutely not only about heavily punishing them, it's entirely about beautifully rewarding you. Those deeply silent battles you bravely fought, the exact ones absolutely nobody totally knew about, the exact ones that completely left you incredibly exhausted, but actively still bravely standing, they beautifully built a massive resume exactly that heaven is completely now beautifully unfolding totally publicly. Your massive promotion absolutely wasn't delayed. It was actively being deeply prepared. Your massive blessings absolutely weren't completely missing. They were actively deeply accumulating. Every single private, beautiful victory perfectly became a massive line exactly on your deep divine record. Exactly that completely now loudly speaks vastly louder than their dark accusations absolutely ever possibly could. You absolutely weren't just heavily protected, you were deeply observed, highly validated, and totally chosen for exactly what beautifully comes next. Heaven absolutely didn't just completely keep you totally alive. It actively took deep notes, and exactly now those beautiful notes are completely turning beautifully into massive rewards. Number 13. Their massive judgment is rock-solid proof exactly that your amazing next season completely requires absolutely no heavy opposition exactly to completely advance. There are absolutely some deep seasons exactly where heavy resistance beautifully becomes a massive teacher, perfectly shaping your deep grit and beautifully sharpening your massive discernment. But this amazing season absolutely isn't one of them. You're actively stepping directly into an amazing phase of your beautiful life, exactly where deep conflict would entirely only heavily slow down exactly what God beautifully intends to perfectly accelerate. The wicked absolutely weren't heavily judged exactly because you completely lacked deep strength. They were heavily judged exactly because their dark presence would entirely deeply interfere exactly with the massive speed and deep clarity of your amazing next assignment. Exactly what's beautifully coming absolutely doesn't heavily require deep endurance. It completely requires massive momentum. God absolutely isn't just actively moving heavy obstacles. He's actively eliminating absolutely anything exactly that would totally force you to heavily negotiate your amazing progress. Your amazing next level absolutely won't be completely built exactly on long, heavy battles, deep emotional exhaustion, or completely unnecessary dark confrontations. It will be beautifully built exactly on massive movement, deep precision, and incredibly rapid growth. That's exactly why massive judgment completely feels so incredibly sudden. God is beautifully clearing the massive runway perfectly, so you can beautifully rise completely without any heavy turbulence. You're perfectly entering an amazing season exactly where the absolute slightest deep distraction could completely derail exactly what heaven is actively preparing to perfectly launch directly through you. Their massive downfall is absolutely not a joyful celebration exactly of your deep victory totally over them. It's a massive confirmation exactly that they were completely incompatible exactly with your massive elevation. They were vastly too incredibly slow exactly for exactly where you're beautifully headed, vastly too incredibly chaotic exactly for exactly what you're beautifully building, vastly too incredibly threatened exactly by the deep identity you've perfectly finally grown completely into. God clearly saw exactly that if he absolutely didn't actively remove them, they would completely try to forcefully reattach themselves exactly to the old parts of you, exactly that absolutely no longer totally exist, and forcefully pull you completely back exactly into toxic cycles you've perfectly already completely outgrown. This massive shift is entirely about massive pace. This massive breakthrough is entirely about deep trajectory. This massive judgment is entirely about deep environment. God is actively removing every single dark voice exactly that would completely have heavily doubted you exactly in delicate moments, exactly where massive speed is entirely essential. He's actively silencing every single dark hand exactly that would completely have desperately tried to forcefully interfere exactly when deep precision is entirely required. He's actively eliminating every single dark presence exactly that absolutely cannot completely breathe exactly in the massive altitude you're perfectly actively rising to. Your massive calling is perfectly entering an amazing phase exactly where deep friction absolutely isn't heavily strengthening. It's totally obstructive. Your amazing assignment absolutely needs beautifully clear skies. Your amazing next chapter absolutely won't actively involve heavily fighting exactly for ground. It will completely involve actively occupying massive new ground, vastly faster, exactly than the enemy can actively react. It completely won't heavily require desperately defending your deep identity. It will completely require bravely stepping beautifully boldly directly into it, completely with absolutely no heavy resistance, totally slowing your massive stride. That's exactly why massive judgment is perfectly happening. Absolutely not entirely because of exactly what they deeply did, but entirely because of exactly what God is perfectly actively about to beautifully do directly through you. Your massive acceleration absolutely doesn't completely leave any room exactly for dark enemies. Your massive elevation absolutely doesn't completely leave any space exactly for deep distraction. Your massive destiny absolutely doesn't heavily require their active participation or their heavy opposition. The beautiful path is completely being perfectly cleared entirely because this exact time you're perfectly meant to beautifully fly completely without absolutely anything heavily pulling directly at your beautiful wings. Number 14, you completely can't ever be totally stopped exactly, because God perfectly already completely finished exactly what they mistakenly thought they were entirely actively interrupting. They actively spent so incredibly much precious time desperately plotting, heavily delaying, actively interfering, and darkly strategizing exactly against you entirely because they completely, truly, deeply believed they were entirely actively blocking something incredibly fragile. They foolishly assumed your massive destiny was entirely, still currently under deep construction, only halfway totally developed, incredibly vulnerable, and extremely easy to completely derail. Exactly what they absolutely didn't completely know is exactly that God absolutely doesn't ever start absolutely anything. He absolutely hasn't completely already totally finished. Your amazing life absolutely wasn't constantly unfolding exactly in deep uncertainty. It was perfectly unfolding exactly in deep revelation. You absolutely weren't constantly chasing after deep victory. You were perfectly walking exactly in the true direction God had completely already totally stamped as completely complete. This is exactly why their dark attacks absolutely never completely aligned exactly with the dark arc outcome they heavily expected. They were completely actively throwing small stones exactly at a massive building whose deep foundation had completely already been totally secured perfectly in heaven. They were desperately trying to forcefully jam closed heavy doors exactly that God had completely already proudly labeled exactly as completely yours. They desperately tried to completely sabotage a beautiful path exactly that was completely already beautifully laid perfectly out long before you bravely took your very first bold step. They truly thought they were entirely blocking your amazing progress, but they were entirely completely only accidentally bumping directly up exactly against a massive destiny, exactly that perfectly existed long before they completely ever did. You completely can't ever be totally stopped entirely because you're absolutely not actively creating a new future. You're perfectly catching completely up exactly to one exactly that's completely already perfectly written. You're absolutely not actively fighting exactly for deep victory. You're perfectly unveiling exactly what God completely already totally accomplished, exactly in deep realms they absolutely cannot ever actively access, truly understand, or ever undo. That's exactly why every single deep setback perfectly became a massive setup. That's exactly why every single heavy delay perfectly turned completely into a massive redirection. That's exactly why every single dark trap they heavily built perfectly became the exact same beautiful place God perfectly revealed his massive hand totally over your beautiful life. You absolutely weren't completely being totally defeated. You were beautifully being totally aligned. Exactly to them, your massive resilience was incredibly confusing. Exactly to God, your massive resilience was perfect prophecy, beautifully unfolding. They fully expected your total breakdown. God perfectly scheduled your massive breakthrough. They fully expected your total downfall. God perfectly rehearsed your massive rise. They fully expected the dark story exactly to completely end, exactly in deep darkness. God completely already perfectly wrote the beautiful ending exactly in bright light. You completely can't ever be totally stopped entirely, because the amazing race you're perfectly actively running absolutely isn't a deep competition. It's a massive confirmation. The exact moment you proudly showed up exactly in this world, the absolute true outcome had completely already been totally declared. That's exactly why their dark warfare was absolutely always completely mismatched. They were completely actively fighting a perfectly finished massive script completely, while you were perfectly actively living it beautifully out, exactly one amazing scene exactly at a time. Exactly what they desperately tried to actively interrupt is absolutely something they completely never ever had any access to. God perfectly completed your massive victory, extremely long, completely before they ever conceived their dark attacks. So absolutely no matter exactly how incredibly aggressively they desperately tried to actively interfere, they were absolutely always incredibly far too late. You absolutely aren't actively fighting exactly for massive destiny. You completely are exactly the true manifestation exactly of massive destiny. And massive destiny completely can't ever be totally stopped exactly by dirty hands. Far too incredibly small exactly to completely touch. Exactly what God has completely already totally settled. When you take a step back and look at everything God has been doing in your life, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Nothing the wicked built against you had the authority to stand. Not the lies, not the delays, not the coordinated attacks, not the cult-like structures formed to drain you, derail you, or destabilize you. Every single tactic they used only revealed another layer of who you truly are. And every battle they initiated only exposed how divinely backed you've always been. God didn't just protect you. He studied you, shaped you, positioned you, and then elevated you at the exact moment when their power evaporated. You didn't rise because the wicked stopped fighting. You rose because their influence no longer mattered. Judgment isn't just happening around you. It's happening because of who you've become. Every lie they told is collapsing under truth. Every trap they set is collapsing under exposure. Every narrative they crafted is collapsing under the weight of God's authorship unfolding in real time. Heaven used your patience as evidence, your endurance as proof, your integrity as testimony. The wicked thought you were vulnerable, but all along you were being evaluated for a promotion they could never stop. They studied your weaknesses while heaven documented your strength. They rehearsed your destruction while God finalized your destiny. And now everything they tried to conceal, twist, or sabotage is unraveling. Not because you retaliated, but because God stepped into the room and declared the case closed. This entire journey reveals something even deeper. You were unstoppable the moment God finished writing your story. You weren't surviving attacks. You were outgrowing versions of yourself they depended on. Their collapse was triggered by your awakening. Their judgment was triggered by your evolution. And your elevation was ignited by the truth that finally rose to the surface. You cannot be stopped because God already established the ending before your enemies even appeared in the story. You're not entering a new season. You're stepping into a fulfilled one. The runway is clear, the opposition has been removed, the narrative has been rewritten. Your blessings are no longer delayed, they are in motion. And the same people who underestimated you will now watch the divine completion of what they tried to interrupt. Your life is shifting publicly. Your identity is being announced spiritually, and your destiny, the one they tried so hard to sabotage, is unfolding with unstoppable force. If this message spoke to your spirit, don't leave without supporting the channel. Make sure you subscribe, like this video, drop a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your engagement helps this message reach the people God intended. Blessings to you, chosen one. Greater is unfolding from here. God bless you. Amen.